Yet what we continue to hear is that Israel needs to work with the Palestinians, that they need to cede land to the West Bank and work with the Gaza Palestinians, as if somehow all of these problems are going to be papered over and they're going to go away, and that somehow Israel will be able to get back to the position that it was in 2000, when it was working with one leader over one Palestinian people who controlled both territories. So what I am seeing right now is a misguided policy that truly began under the Bush administration and has strayed further under the Obama administration, and we are now at a point where we need to walk ourselves back. We need to start to think about how to re-engage our public. We need to talk about Hasbara. We need to talk about getting out to our congressmen and start to explain that whereas before it was never simple. I mean, the Arab-Israeli conflict was never a simple matter to solve. But with this conflict right now, I believe that the Palestinian conflict, the Hamas-Fatah conflict, the internecine war, the civil war that the Palestinians are now engaged in, is probably the first thing that needs to be solved before you can even get back to the solution of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. So I can't really tell you that this is a positive development, but I believe that right now that sunlight is the best antiseptic. We've got to at least get people to understand that things have changed. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not what it used to be. The Arab-Israeli conflict is now the Palestinian conflict that needs to be solved before we even get back to peacemaking. So with that, I'll just say that I wrote this book to explain to people that this is not just an issue of what the Israelis and Palestinians are doing. It's not just an issue of trying to defend Israel. And a lot of the time what you hear, everybody's here probably because they want to advocate for Israel on some level or another. But what we often do, I think too many people do, is we advocate for Israel by defending it. We say, we have to understand why Israel went into Gaza during Operation Cast Lead of December 08 or January 09. You have to understand why Israel attacked a tunnel the other day with warships, because there were rockets that were coming in from the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip. You have to understand why Israel has placed sanctions on the Gaza Strip. Well, because Hamas controls it, and they're a suicide bombing organization. But none of that stuff seems to matter. Ultimately, those sorts of things seem to fall on deaf ears. What I hope this book does, and what I hope this conversation can start for all of us tonight, is the idea that it's not only about Israel. There are other dynamics at play. It's not to say that Israel doesn't have very difficult choices to make. Ultimately, Israel will have to make concessions and compromise. And I don't think that this is necessarily a good thing in the long run for Israel, because Israel ultimately wants to sign a peace agreement with a Palestinian neighbor that wants to live side by side in peace with them for perpetuity. This is not going to allow that to happen for now. But what this will do is at least allow you to turn the tables on your Palestinian interlocutors and be able to say, this needs to be solved first before we even get back to the table. Figure out who speaks for you. Figure out who your Martin Luther King or your Mahatma Gandhi is, and then get back to us. But until then, there's really essentially nothing to talk about. So with that, I'll close, and I'm more than happy. I always find that the best part of these discussions are the Q&A, and I always find that there are questions that I had never even thought of from the audience, so I'm more than happy to take whatever questions you have. Yes, sir.
There were, back in the 80s and 90s, there was talk that Israel propped up Hamas against the PLO. To what extent is that true, and when?
It's very true. It was, apart from the decision by Ariel Sharon to destroy the Fatah infrastructure after the Intifada began in 2000, I would say that that was the other major mistake that the Israelis made. In the early 1980s, there was an organization by the name of Al-Mujamma al-Islami. This is just simply the Islamic group. And it was led by a paraplegic, charismatic leader by the name of Ahmed Yassin. For those of you who know Ahmed Yassin, he went on to become the leader of Hamas for many years until he was assassinated. What the Israelis had hoped to do was to prop up his organization. At the time, he was an Islamist, but he had never exhorted his followers to carry out violence against Israel. So in other words, the Israelis knew that he was no fan of Israel. He didn't want to celebrate Hanukkah in Tel Aviv. There was no question about it. But at the time, you have to think about it in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the Palestinians were really known for one thing and one thing only under Yasser Arafat. The Black September, PLO, terrorist attacks where, airports and airplanes and Munich massacres. I mean, there was, terrorism was an epidemic And Yasser Arafat was the culprit. So the Israelis at the time decided, hey, we're going to try to sponsor another group, give them more backing. And what that essentially enabled Yassin to do was to establish footholds all around the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and to gain following. And what happened was, after Hamas was founded, all of those mosques and food shelters and all the things that he had done through the Islamic group, Al-Mujamma al-Islami, became the cornerstone of Hamas. And Hamas today still uses these elements to gain support. In other words, Hamas, they always like to say, we're a charitable organization. We're involved in feeding the poor and schools and kindergartens and food shelters. Those are the things that Hamas likes to say that they're doing. But ultimately, those things are the cornerstone of their operation. And I can tell you that always a portion of whatever money they raise goes back into the coffers of their war chest and is ultimately used against Israel. Because if you look at their charter, if you look at what Hamas is after, it really exists for one reason and one reason only, and that is the destruction of the state of Israel. But that Mujamma al-Islami was always the cornerstone of what became Hamas. It's an excellent question, and I talk about it a little bit in the book. Yeah.
Getting back to Iran for a minute, do you think the demonstrations will have any effect on the government in terms of the nuclear policy and maybe overthrowing them?
It's a very interesting question. For those of you who didn't hear it, the question was about the demonstrations on the street of Iran. As everybody knows, in June of last year, hundreds of thousands of people came out in the streets to protest the what appeared to be rigged elections, where Ahmadinejad essentially stole a second term. I think it reveals the fact that the Iranian regime is nowhere near as strong as it would like to project, for sure. But I think that predicting the demise of the Islamic Republic is ill-advised at this point. And the reason why is that they have an infrastructure in place. It's called the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. This is a terrorist organization. It's been designated by our government, by our Treasury Department. It's illegal to do business with them, and they are essentially known to be the backbone of the Iranian regime. They're the backbone of the Iranian nuclear program. They essentially are the enforcers, and those are the people who are out there, shooting demonstrators. They're breaking the kneecaps of people who are out there opposing the regime. And ultimately, I believe the demonstrators are going to be scared off until another round. And I don't know when that next round is going to be. There'll be something else that happens that sets off the Iranian people. But ultimately, I believe that sanctions is the thing that could work. For those of you who are following, I don't know if anybody here is involved with AIPAC or other lobby groups on behalf of Israel, but there is legislation in play right now. It's called the Iran Refined Petroleum Sanctions Act. I don't know if this name rings a bell to anybody, but most people don't know that Iran imports about 40% of its refined gasoline products from the outside. This is remarkable for a country that produces as much raw petroleum as Iran does. They have to drill, send out the oil, and then have it brought back in its refined form in order to make cars and other machinery work in their country.